Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to join us today. My name is Yan, and I'll be chairing today's session. So today, it's really great pleasure to have our old colleague here, Dr. Sijie Hu from Renmin University, to give us a talk on her latest research, which is titled "Celebrating Legacy: The Intergenerational Transmission of Reproduction and Human Capital in Ming-Qing Chinese Families." Before we start, let me just briefly introduce to our audience here about Dr. Sijie Hu. So she's an assistant professor of economics at the Renmin University, and she has been recently working extensively on Chinese demographic patterns using evidence from Chinese genealogy books. And also join us together here today is Professor Carol Su, who is here, and who is a professor of economics at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And I think people here are really very familiar with him. With her. She's a leading expert in Chinese economic history, and her research interests cover market development and trade in China, the political economy of family relief, kinship organization, social mobility, and long-run living standard. So later on, please enjoy the discussions between Sijie and Kazu. Just to clarify, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the Q&A box here. So after the discussion between the speaker and the discussant, so later on, I will just read out this question to our speaker. And in general, this talk will run about an hour, and then which will be followed by 15 minutes discussion. And then eventually, for the rest of the time, we will have this Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, I will now just hand over the stage to Sijie. Sijie.
Thank you, Zhang, for the very generous introduction. And also thanks to Professor Xu for being my discussant today. So I just share my screen here. And okay, so thank you all for being here. And I'm Sijie, and it's really a great honor for me to be here and to share with you this paper. And it's a paper on the intergenerational transmission of reproduction and human capital in Ming-Qing Chinese families. So first, please allow me to, first, please allow me to very briefly talk about my motivation here. And we know that in today's China, China's fertility rate was very low. It was only about 1.3 in 2020, and it's dropped to record low 1.09 in 2022. And because of this very low fertility rate, and the Chinese government tries to address this risk of having a very low fertility rate, that the government actually has implemented a series of policies and to encourage couples to have more births and to increase fertility rates, including relaxing a 2-child policy to a 3-child policy, and also to develop the public interest, the child care to reduce costs of childbirth, parenting, and also education. However, today's Chinese couples are still quite reluctant to have more children because of the very high cost of raising them. So that's very different from what we know about the fertility pattern in historical China. And I guess that this picture here is very close to our impression of a traditional Chinese family with multiple generations living together and a lot of children in one generation. And so the big contrast between the past and present in terms of the fertility pattern also makes me wonder how couples in late imperial China make their fertility choices, and were they also making rational choices, and what were their strategies for bloodline survival and human capital formations. So to answer these questions, I mainly look at 2 trade-offs in Ming-Qing Chinese families. And one is the Darwinian trade-off, the trade-off between reproduction in one generation and long-run reproductive success. And the other one is the Beccarian trade-off, the trade-off between child quantity and quality. So I guess that to analyze these 2 trade-offs and also to understand the demographic dynamics in history, can shed a light on the transition from Mausudian stagnation to modern economic growth. So that's also very important for us to understand this, to know more about the fertility or demographic pattern in historical China. So in terms of the two trade-offs, I'd like to give you more details, especially for the Darwinian trade-off. And I guess most of us are not that familiar with the term. So it usually means the trade-off between fertility and survival. And the evolutionary scientists just find that high fertility rate does not always translate to a high survival rate. And it was first found in the bird populations, that birds just evolved their clutch sizes for optimal survival of descendants rather than the maximal number of descendants they could have in the clutch. So they have a moderate level of clutch size, basically. And later, just a lot of findings on these trade-offs just later developed into the life history theory in evolutionary biology, and evolutionary biologists find the trade-off between fertility and different biological traits to increase the survival rate in different species. And in this paper, what I'm looking at here is the trade-off between reproduction in the first or in the previous generation, in one generation, and the long-run reproductive success to see if the reproductive success could be transmitted across generations. And the other type of trade-off I'm looking at in this paper is the Beccarian trade-off, and I guess we are more familiar with this term. Is a trade-off between child quantity and quality, and it was first proposed by Professor Gary Becker. So under certain budget constraints, the parents are more willing to invest in increasing their children's human capital rather than expanding the size of the family. So it's more like if the Darwinian trade-off did exist, and the Beccarian trade-off is more like a mechanism through which reproduction could affect the long-run reproductive success. Okay, so in terms of the existing literature, actually, we have the unified or the evolutionary growth theory that proposed by Glo and his co-authors that actually linked the two different types of trade-offs together. And so in the evolutionary growth theory, they argue that natural selection originates economic growth. So during the Mausudian epoch, natural selection brought about a gradual increase in the representation of traits associated with predisposition towards offspring quality in the population, and inherited traits led to increase the income and greater reproductive success, becoming more widespread in the total population. And following that, they also have an empirical work just gives more quantitative evidence on these two trade-offs. So they studied Quebec from 1608 to 1800 and used a very large data sample that includes nearly 500,000 individuals. And they find that moderate fecundity coupled with a higher level of education was more conducive to the continuity of the lines of descent. So it's not that it's not always better to have a very large family size. So there would be a negative effect on survival of larger family sizes also suggest, and this kind of negative effect also suggests the presence of child quality trade-offs. So if in one generation there are too many descendants, then maybe each of them cannot have enough resources to develop their quality, and that would further harm the long-run reproductive success, basically, to harm the survival of the family line in the long run. And besides their work, that actually we can also find an extensive amount of literature, especially empirical literature, working on these two trade-offs. So first, for the Darwinian trade-off within the human species, we've already seen quite a few sociologists and also anthropologists working on the different types of Darwinian trade-offs, including the trade-off between female fertility and offspring survivalship, and also parental fertility and next generation fertility. And they also find just in different time periods and in different societies, actually, they also find mixing evidence for the existence or the presence of the Darwinian trade-off. But there's one paper I'd like to specifically mention here. It's by Professor Song Xi, Cameron Campbell, and also James Lee, and they're using the population register record in Northeast China in the Qing dynasty, and also the Qing imperial lineages, genealogies. And they find they want to analyze the survival of the patrilineages. And they find that for those patrilineages that could survive longer, and usually those family lines always have a high social origin. So their ancestor is always a high social status man. And then for those successful patrilineages, which survived longer, that they find the strategies they use was not to maximize the number of descendants in each generation, but to minimize the risk of extinction in each generation. So that's also where they believe that there was a kind of Darwinian trade-off and also a Beccarian trade-off, that the negative effect of a large family size just suggests the presence of a quantity-quality trade-off of children, basically. And for the Beccarian trade-off part, we have also seen a lot of empirical works on it in different time periods, and also in different societies in the UK, the US, and Korea, and basically a lot of places. And they also find mixing evidence, basically. Some of them support the idea that the Beccarian trade-off did exist in history, but some of them challenge this idea. And in particular, I'd like to mention that Professor Xu's paper in 2017 on the Journal of Economic Growth, actually, she uses the genealogical sample in Tongcheng County in Anhui Province, and she finds that before in the Ming and Qing dynasties, and she finds that before 1800, we can find strong evidence on the presence of a quantity-quality trade-off in Tongcheng. However, after 1800, the trade-off just disappeared. And for a very recent paper by and his co-authors, that they also use the population register records in Liaoning province, and they find that there was trade-off, this kind of Beccarian trade-off, the child quantity trade-off, but the trade-off only existed after 1800, not before 1800. So the mixing evidence here also suggests that there may be a regional, there must be a regional variation in China, that in some places we can find a certain fertility pattern, but in some other places we'll find a different type of fertility pattern. So that's also where I hope that my research could insert into the existing literature, just by providing more quantitative evidence on these two trade-offs, the presence or the absence of these two trade-offs in the Ming and the Qing dynasties. So that's basically what I do in this paper, that I use a new genealogical data set of 36,000 males from 6 lineages in Southeast China to demonstrate the fertility choice and human capital formation in Chinese families in a multi-generational model. And the empirical question that I try to address here is that, does reproductive success involve intergenerational trade-offs? And as I said, that I'm mainly looking at 2 different trade-offs, the Darwinian trade-off. So I use the number of sons a man had to measure his reproduction, and then the number of patrilineal grandsons, great-grandsons, and great-great-grandsons a man had to measure the long-run reproductive success, and to see if his reproductive success could transmit it to across generations. And the second part is that I'm doing to analyze the Beccarian trade-off, and I use the number of brothers a male had, including himself. So it's that is the number of sons that a man's father had to measure the child quantity, the family size, and use whether the male could get married or not, and whether he could obtain an academic degree, the 科举 degree or not, to measure his quality. And what I find is that it's also slightly different from the previous research, that I find the presence of a Darwinian trade-off, but I also argue it's a little bit weak Darwinian trade-off, but it also finds no strong evidence of Beckerian trade-offs in the 6 lineages. So then I like to talk about the data that I'm using in this paper. So I'm using the genealogical records of 6 Chinese lineages. And in total, in my sample, that I have information about 36,000 men and 29,000 women, so their wives and concubines, and that's that's cover about more than 20 generations family members in my sample, and that's about 500-year family records. And of the 6 lineages that I'm using in this paper, 3 of them are common lineages, and they are all located in Chuzhou Prefecture in South Zhejiang Province, the Huang, the Que, and the Zhou lineages. And I have to say thanks to Professor Cao Shuji and also Professor Jiang Qing at Shanghai Jiao Tong University for kindly sharing the genealogical books with me about for these 3 lineages. And the other 3 lineages, I call them elite lineages, and they are the Zha lineage from Haining County in Hangzhou Prefecture, the Gu lineage in Suzhou Prefecture, and the Zhuang lineage in Wujing County in Changzhou Prefecture. So the main criteria I used to distinguish between the common lineages and the elite lineages are basically the number of degree holders, the number, both the number and also the proportion of those gentry class, those degree holders and the 科举 degree holders and office holders in the lineages. And this picture here is just a portrait of a high-ranking official in the Gu lineage, and actually in the 3 elite lineages, they have a lot of 科举 degree holders and office holders. In the Zhuang lineage in Wujing County and also the Zha lineage in Haining County, they have more than 13% of their male population, actually male family members actually were degree holders and office holders. So that was a very, very high percentage in Ming and Qing dynasties. So that's basically the 6 lineages I'm looking at in this paper. And in terms of the genealogies define the lineages membership and also recorded the things important to the administration and the organization of the lineages. And the practice of keeping genealogies can be traced back to the time of the 6 dynasties. So before the Song dynasties, in the 6 dynasties and also the Sui and Tang dynasties, keeping genealogies was basically a privilege of the blue-blooded aristocratic families, because they want to maintain the purity of their family lines. So they need to have a matching doors marriages to keep that purity. So they have to keep the genealogies and to check the genealogies. However, after the Tang Song transition period and since the Song dynasty, the nature and also the composition of gentry class, the elites in China changed a lot. And then keeping genealogies also become a very popular thing that every family in theory could just keep and compile their own genealogy. And it's become a very, very popular practice, especially in Southeast China. But although each genealogy was privately compiled, as Professor Xu mentioned before, the Ming and Qing genealogies were familiar with and adhered to popular rules of compilation. So as we know that for the genealogies, there may be more than 30 or even more different layouts of genealogies. But even in those very different genealogies with very different layouts, the main information, the kinds of information that they're included in the genealogies were pretty much the same. So that's also why we can combine genealogies from different parts of China together and to do research, because the information that they included are pretty much the same. And for my research here, that's the main for all those information that I used in this paper is mainly from the genealogical tables and charts where the lineage members are listed. And here is the And here is a very typical page from the Chinese genealogical book. It's from the Jia genealogies. And so every man would have their male family member, would have their own mini biography, their own entry in the genealogical books. And we can find a lot of useful individual level information from their own entry, including the names of the men, of those males, not only his original name, but also like the courtesy name, 字, and the pen name for this guy, Ji Ru here. His Hao, the pen name was also included, recorded. And also we can find his wife's surname, their birth and death dates, the status records of the man, if the man was a degree holder or office holder, or if he learned Confucian classics before, that they would also record this kind of status information here. And also the burial place of the man and the number of sons he had and the names of his sons. So because of all this valuable data that I could do this research here, but because the genealogies were not compiled for us to do research, right? So there are still many selection problems in the genealogical data. And I guess the first question we would ask is who is included in the genealogies? Fortunately, as also pointed out by previous research, that it is the ritualistic aspect, not wealth or status, that determines whether a person could be included in the genealogy or not. And from the ritualistic aspect, the men and their wives are both considered ritualistically significant, because that's a main players here that could actually contribute to the survival of the patrilineages, so that they are all very important and they would all be included in the genealogies. But unfortunately, the number of children is not complete. Most daughters and also all sons who died in infancy are not recorded in the genealogies. So in my sample, that's the total number of recorded sons in my sample is 41,000 sons, but I only have the only recorded 9,484 daughters. So daughters were highly under-registered in the genealogical books. However, the number of sons who survived the infancy is complete. And this information is actually the most important piece of information that should be included in the genealogies and would not be influenced by his own wealth or status or his father's wealth or status. And so because of the nature of the genealogical records, the number of descendants I use in this paper, so when I mean the long-run reproductive success, I actually mean the patrilineal male descendants in the 6 lineages. So because I cannot, there's no other types of descendants being recorded in the genealogies. But I think that for the research question here, the survival of the patrilineage, it also makes sense to use the patrilineal male descendants. After all, in a traditional Chinese family, just only the male descendants who carried the family name count, right? So that would not affect, I don't think that would affect the research here very much. But I also have a robustness check, especially for the Bacarian trade-off part. I try to use some of the daughters' records, and I hope that I can have time to show you the daughters' result today. Okay, and so then in terms of the empirical strategies that I'm using in this paper, the first about the Darwinian trade-off. So the model that I run here is quite straightforward. So my dependent variable here means the patrilineal male descendants in the subsequent 3 generations. So it's a number of patrilineal grandsons, great-grandsons, and great-great-grandsons male had. And this is an individual level kind of regression here. So I denotes male individuals. And my key independent variable here is the recorded number of sons male had. And from a qualitative pattern here between the number of sons and the number of grandsons, great-grandsons, and great-great-grandsons here, we can see that the relationship seems not to be monotonic and linear here. So I also control for the include the square term of the number of sons here. And I also condition on a group of control variables, including the man's own social status, number of marriages, whether he had a pen name or not, whether he had a hall or not, whether he was a firstborn son in the family, whether he was an adoptee in the family or not, and whether he survived to adulthood, whether he migrated out of the town, and his 50-year birth cohort and the lineage fixed effect. One thing I want to mention here is that in this part of the analysis, I'm not using everyone in my sample. I'm not using every man in my sample, but I'm only using the men who had complete records of descendants in the subsequent 4 generations. So in some of the cases, the men, like the one of the 4 men, one of his grandsons maybe did not have the complete records on the sons that he had. So that makes the man did not have the complete records on the great-grandsons he had. So then I have to drop this man from my sample, this subsample here. So finally, I have 9,336 men who had complete records of the descendants in the subsequent 4 generations to be studied in this part of the analysis. And in terms of the control variables, especially for the first 5, I'd like to give you more details about these control variables that I mentioned that I include in this part of the analysis. So first, 3 control variables: the class, marriages, and how I control for the they are controlled for the effects of the male's socioeconomic characteristics on his long-run reproductive success. So the class here indicates whether the man belonged to a status group higher than status 1. So based on the status records in the genealogical books, that for all these men in their own mini biography, I divide every man in my sample into 14 different status groups. With the status 1, the lowest social status group, that for this men, they do not have a status records in their own mini biography. So I just treat them as commoners, just they have no social status information. But from status 2, group status 2 to status 14, they are the men who had some kinds of status records in their own mini biography, and with larger the number, it means the higher the social status. So for everyone who had a status higher who belongs to a status group higher than 1, their class variable here, I just coded as 1 for their class variable, and otherwise it's a 0 here. So that's a way I control for their social class. And I also condition on the number of marriages they had, because also from previous research, we know that the number of marriages a man had, especially in historical China, when remarriages and also having concubines was not that uncommon, and that the wealthy and also high social status people would have multiple marriages throughout his life, during his life. So I also condition on that. And finally, the how, the pen name, whether the man had a pen name or not, it's more like a human capital kind of control. It's that I hope to control for it to capture some also socioeconomic characteristics that cannot be fully captured by the class variable and also the marriages variable. For some people, about 1,000 people, 1,000 men in my sample, that they actually do not have any kinds of social status records in their own mini biography, but they had Hao. And I think that only the literate, usually only literate person would give himself a Hao, a pen name, and to use it when they wrote a poem or a prose. So that also means something. That also means that he at least acquired the basic literacy training before, and it's highly likely that he is also from a quite wealthy family that could put resources in him to train his basic literacy skills. So I also control for that. And for the firstborn, the adoptee here, I controlled them because being the firstborn son or the adopted son would entail higher expectations to continue the family line and perform well. So that may also, they may feel more responsibilities in having more sons, or just to make sure that the lineage could survive. So I think that may also being the firstborn son or an adoptee in the family may also means may also have an effect in term on their reproduction, their long run reproductive success. So I also control for them. And the next part is on the Bakarian trade-off. The basic regression model that I use here, the basic regression model is just like the following equation here, that my dependent variable is the male individual's quality and measured by two different variables. One is that whether the man could get married or not, and the other is whether he obtained an academic degree or if he's an office holder or not. So the marital status, I think, is also a quite reasonable quality measure. It's because that at least in my sample, for all the men who survived to adulthood, the 23% of them failed to find a wife. So I think that also means something about tells us something about their quality. And also for the degree here is a more traditional way to measure the human capital in traditional China. So I also use the same, just if a man in his own mini biography stating that he obtained a Keju degree before, or if he was an office holder, then I just then for his degree variable here, it is coded as 1 if he had some degree or an office being in the office before. Okay, so then my independent variable here is the number of brothers that male had. So that's including himself. So that is the number of sons that the man's father had in the family. And I also condition on all the control variables. Most of them are controlled also in the previous model, but I also control for the father's social class here, father's number of marriages, and also grandfather's number of sons, so the number of uncles of this man here, and also the grandfather's social class in this part of the analysis. So then I like to show you my results on the two trade-offs. So first, for the Darwinian trade-off, the trade-off between reproduction and long-run reproductive success. Here is my baseline model that I'm using because my dependent variable is the number of patrilineal male descendants in generation 3, 4, 5, which means grandsons, great-grandsons, and great-great-grandsons. So it's a count variable. So I use a negative binomial regression here. All the coefficients here are the incidence rate ratios. So if they are larger than 1, it means there is a positive correlation. And if the coefficient is smaller than 1, it means it has a negative correlation here. So for in all the 9 columns, we can always find a positive coefficient on the number of sons. No matter what control variables that I include in the model, that it always maintained to be statistically significant and also larger than 1. But for the square term of the number of sons, it's always smaller than 1. So it suggests that there should be an optimal level of fertility for the long-run reproductive success. And also for the 3 variables, control variables on social status or socioeconomic status here, the class, the how, and also the marriages, they are also all statistically significant, and they all have a long-lasting positive effect on the long-run reproductive success of a man. And to better illustrate my results here, I also draw this figure. So so the x-axis is the number of sons a man had, and the y-axis is the predicted number of patrilineal male descendants a man had. So for the we can find quite clear, obvious here that the optimal level of fertility for the long-run reproductive success is about 7 sons. So especially for the great-grandson, the 2 dashed line here, 2 dashed lines here, the great-grandsons and great-great-grandsons. So after having more than, if a man had more than 7 sons, then that's may even have a negative effect on the number of great-grandsons and great-great-grandsons he can have. And I also try to separate all the men based on their social status. So whether they belong to status 1, the group status 1, or they belong to a higher status group. And we can find this very strong and also long-lasting positive effect that the social status played in the long-run reproductive success here. However, I just like I mentioned before, I think that although it's quite clear that indeed we can find a Darwinian trade-off in the 6 lineages, but I argue that it's a quite weak one. And the reason why I argue that is because 99% of the men didn't have fewer than 6 sons, basically, in my sample. And 7 sons is actually a very, very high fertility level. 7 sons probably means having 13 or 14 children. So that's a very large family size. And most of people in the sample only have fewer than 6 sons, and both the median and the mean of the number of sons that people had in the sample is 2 sons. So I guess that for most of the people in the 6 lineages, having more sons could directly translate into having more grandsons, great-grandsons, and great-great-grandsons. So they were not affected, basically, they were not affected by this Darwinian trade-off here. And I also try to do some robustness checks by using the OLS model and to further conditioning on the man's lifespan, and also to separate the common and elite lineages and into 2 samples, and all this the results are basically the same, pretty much the same with the baseline models, baseline results. But one thing I like to show you is that I also treat just not treating the number of sons as a continuous variable, but treat it as a categorical variable, and use a 1 son here as a reference group to see if the relationship still holds. And from the coefficients here, we can still find that for the 7 sons, especially for the number of great-grandsons and great-great-grandsons here, the coefficients on the 7 sons are the largest here. So it still means that the optimal level of fertility is about 7 sons. So that's also quite similar to our previous baseline results. And then, but still, although I argue that it's a quite weak Darwinian trade-off, but still the hump-shaped relationship here still suggests that there might be some kind of Beckerian trade-off. So that's why that having a very large family size is actually not conducive to the long-run reproductive success, because it will harm the quality of the descendants in that generation, and will further harm the long-run reproductive success. So then I'd like to show you my results on the Bakerian trade-off, the quality trade-off of children. And I also, as I mentioned before, that I think it's a mechanism through which reproduction could impact long-run reproductive success. And here first is the baseline result. I'm using a logistic regression here. And my first dependent variable used is the marital status of the man, so whether the man could get married or not, and the relationship between that with his the number of brothers he had, the family size. And because I'm using the logistic regression here, and my coefficients are the odd ratios. So it's still that if the coefficient is larger than 1, it means that it has a positive correlation here. So in most cases, if we look at the coefficient on the number of brothers or the number of sons a male's father had, that is always larger than 1 and also statistically significant here. Even if I condition on all these control variables here, that is still it's a quite strong a positive coefficient here, that having more brothers actually is positively correlated with the probability of a man to be married. And also the father's social class, as we would expect, and also the father's number of marriages all have a very strong positive effect here. And then I just change my dependent variable to the degree, so whether the man could obtain a Keju degree or not, or become whether a man was a office holder or not. And we'll find that it's a slightly different pattern here, that before I condition on the father's effects and also the grandfather's effects, the number of brothers always had a also quite strong coefficient here, the statistically significant and also larger than 1. But after I condition on the father's social class and also the number of marriages the father had, his father had, that the number of marriages, just the size of the coefficients dropped a lot, and also it became not as statistically significant, but the father's social class played a very, very important role here that has a very large coefficient here. And in the column 6, I just also include the grandfather's effect, the grandfather's social class, and also the grandfather's number of sons. So the number of uncles that this man had, the male individual had here, and we'll find that the coefficient on the number of brothers just turn to be not statistically significant, but it's still larger than 1, but it's not statistically significant. So at least I think I can say that I cannot find very strong evidence for the presence of a Bakerian trade-off in the 6 lineages, especially when we measured the equality by the marital status. Is quite obvious there. And I also draw the figure here, just the x-axis is the number of brothers one had, and the y-axis is the predicted probability of getting married and of getting a degree. And also that I divide all the men in my sample based on his father's social class, so whether he had a high social class of a high social status father. And we'll find that for the number of, if we measure the marital status here as a quality measure here, we'll find a quite strong positive relationship between the family size and also the child quantity and quality. But if we look at the degree here, the thing that matters more is the father's social status rather than father's reproduction. So basically, we cannot find a very clear relationship, or just the family size didn't play a very important role here in determining whether the man could get a Keju degree or not. And I also do some robustness checks, so like controlling for the lifespan of the man, and it didn't change the results much, but it's just the coefficients turns to be smaller than 1, but it's still not statistically significant. So I guess that I can still say that I just cannot find a strong evidence for the presence of the Bacarian trade-off in the 6 lineages, and then also separate the sample and then try to use some other human capital measure and then look at in different periods. And I guess maybe I have I'll just go very quickly about my results on daughters. And so for all the previous results, I'm showing you the results on the male descendants, but I also don't want to waste all the information on daughters. But the only quality measure that I can have, I can construct based on the genealogical data is the daughter's marriage outcome. So I use that as the proxy for daughter's quality and to find the relationship between the size of the family and whether the daughter could marry the degree or office holder or an office holder or not. So here's the daughter's record I have. I have 4,283 daughters with detailed records being recorded in the genealogies, and the detailed records basically means that I have their marriage outcome. And about 8% of them are recorded as died before getting married. 14% of them recorded married degree or office holders, and the remaining 77% of them just married non-degree or office holders. And this is just an example of the daughter's marriage record that I have from the genealogies. And this guy here is a man who had the most daughters in my sample. And he had experienced 4 marriages throughout his lifetime, and he had 9 daughters in total. And because he himself was a degree holder and later an office holder, so his daughters were, many of them also managed to marry degree holders. And so here's my result, and my dependent variable here is just simply whether the girl married a degree holder or office holder. And here we can see the relationship here just before I conditioning on anything, that we can still find a positive coefficient here on the number of sisters and also number of brothers. However, after I condition on the father's social status and also grandfather's social status, that the coefficient also became not statistically significant. So I think that's still confirmed to what I find before. So for the last about 10 minutes, I'd like to show you the final part of the results I'd like to show you today. So we know that identifying the child quality trade-off is always challenging. And the biggest problem we face is the endogeneity issue we have here is because of the omitted variable bias. There are some unobserved parental preference and family features that I cannot just include in my model. And one way I try to solve this problem is to condition on the grandfather's effect in my baseline model, that I condition on the number of uncles the man had and also the grandfather's social class. And I think that just the grandfather's choices on reproduction and also the his grandfather's choice on the human capital formation may also affect the father's choice on reproduction and human capital formation. So that's so maybe I can capture at least a part of the unobserved parental preference here, but I know that it's not enough. So I also try an instrument variable here that I instrument the number of the family size, the number of sons a father had by father's age at the first son's birth. So why do I use this as an instrument? I first got the idea or inspired by the instrument variable used in Glo and Clamp. So they use the protogenetic interval, that is the time interval between the date of marriage and the first live birth, as a source of exogenous variation in reproduction. But unfortunately, in genealogies, we do not have the marriage date or the birth year of the first birth, because we only have the birth year of sons, but no birth year of daughters. but also because we don't have we only have the sex-specific birth order, but not a birth order among all the children. So we cannot tell whether the son was the first son or actually he was the first child. So we only have the only variable that I can construct here. I just adapted this PI to the age of the father at the birth of his first son. So, so for this PI here, it means that if the couple just had a longer PI, then that means that they wait for a longer time after their marriage before they have their first live birth. So that also means that they would have a shorter reproductive span, and that would lead to a smaller family size. So I use this father's age as the first son's birth, basically have the same logic here. So if the father can have the first son at an earlier age, then he should have a longer reproductive span for having sons, and he should have more sons, basically. And this is the distribution of the father's age at first male birth, and we can find that most of the fathers have their first son during their 20s and early 30s, basically. But still, there are a lot of variations of for some of them have a son at a very later age. So in order to make this IV a valid IV, that we need to make sure that there's it's at least a conditionally exogenous variable, right? And also the time of having the first male birth was at least partially random. And the reason why I think that is random is because in Ming-Qing China, or more specifically in the 6 lineages that I'm looking at here, they're primarily adhered to a natural fertility regime. So I did not find any strong signs to show that they're deliberately controlling their fertility. There's no late starting, longer spacing, or early stopping. So if the man had a surviving son at an earlier age, this suggests that he could have a longer reproductive span, resulting in more surviving sons throughout his life. So basically, he's not choosing to have a son at an later because of his practicing the deliberate fertility controls. But of course, that the time of having the first male birth still have some not random part in it. So I also control for a range of socioeconomic factors to isolate the random variations in father's age, especially if the man is from a very wealthy family background, then he should got married earlier than people who did not from very wealthy families, right? So that will also affect the time that he actually could have his first male birth. So I basically control for all the socioeconomic related factors I controlled before, and I also control for father's lifespan, and in order to at least conditioning on some health-related factors here that may also affect the father's age at his first male birth. So then this is my instrumental variable model that I instrument the number of brothers the male had by the conditionally exogenous variation induced by his father's age at the first son's birth. And here's my instrumented results here that so for the first 2 columns here, I'm showing you the reduced form and results, and the columns 3, 4, 5 are the 2-stage, the instrumented results. So the father's age at first son's birth indeed is negatively correlated with the number of brothers, the number of sons the father could have. So if the father could have the first son at an earlier age, then he could have more sons, basically, during his life. And in columns 4 and 5 here, the coefficients here are the average marginal effects. So we can find that it's basically still quite similar to the based on the logistic regression results there, that having more brothers actually have a positive relationship with the probability of a man to be married and also to get a degree. So that means that for having one more brother, that the man, his probability of being married would be increased by about 9 percentage points, and also to get a degree by to increase the probability of him getting a degree by about 2 percentage points. But still, especially for if we measure the quality by degree here, that we'll find the father's social class is a very important factor here. That having a father who had a higher social class actually could increase the probability by 9 percentage points. And I also try to condition, as I said, that I condition on the father's lifespan, but that also didn't change the results much. Yeah, and I also have a sub-period results here. So for I think that is somehow also confirmed to at least for the last cohort here, the last sub-period here, that it's confirmed to what Professor Xu find in in the Tongcheng County, is that after 1800, basically the trade-off disappeared, and I also find a stronger positive relationship here in the 6 lineages. Okay, so finally, I think I still have maybe 1 minute to very quickly go over to discuss the empirical results that I just showed you. So for the first question is that I want to answer why were the 2 trade-offs so weak in the 6 lineages. And I think that for the rich families, they don't need to do the trade-offs, basically. They could afford both, so they don't need to choose from whether they want to have child quantity or quality, or whether they want to have reproduction in 1 generation or the long-run reproductive success. So they could afford both. Because even if they have large family size, they could still have their sons could still be more likely to be higher in quality compared to the men who did not who is not from rich families. But for the poor families, just they were unable to have a large family size, basically. So they were having a smaller size, not because they want to it's not of their deliberate choice that they want to invest in their son's human capital, because they lack the incentives to do that. If they were not higher social status, if they were not degree holders or office holders, it's also very, very hard for their sons to be degree holders and office holders. And I think that also could, at least to some degree, suggest the reason why China failed to undergo a demographic transition in the 18th and 19th centuries as the Western European countries experienced. From the Western European countries' experiences, we also know that it's always the upper class and also the middle class who first reduce their fertility, even before the demographic transition happened. But I think that's also not the case in China, as Ansley Cole once pointed out, that if a society to experience a secular decline in fertility, the reduced fertility must be an advantage to individual couples. But at least in the 6 lineages here, I think for those rich families, the reduced fertility is not right choice, because even if they have a large family, actually everyone in every son in the family could also experience a higher probability of getting a degree and to be married. So there's no incentive for them to have a reduced fertility, basically. And that's basically all I want to share with you today. So to conclude, that this paper examines the intergenerational transmission of reproduction and human capital in Ming-Qing China, and the empirical investigation reveals the presence of a Darwinian trade-off and largely suggests the absence of Beccarian trade-offs in the 6 lineages. And I also want to point out that the offspring quality was more closely related to the father's social status than to the father's reproduction. And I also think the results suggest a very unequal Chinese society, that the rich people, those high status men, actually could have everything, basically. And that's all from me today, I guess, and thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sijie. And now let's just give a warm welcome to Professor Kelsey to make some comments on Sijie's presentation.
Hey, Professor Xu,
Hi,
you
Karen,
unmute
you
yourself.
have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you for the organizers to inviting me to.
Sorry, is it me or? I cannot hear Professor Xu's voice.
Yeah, we're likely to have a bit of technical issue here. Let's just try again to see if the voice from that side works. No, still not working.
We can't hear you earlier, but I don't know why.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
I cannot.
It might be the mic, because we can hear you very clearly from the beginning, but that later on it was there was some noise from the mic, and then it stopped working.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, it works now.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to discuss this paper. Very nice presentation and paper. And so this paper is called Celebrating Legacy. And let me keep my summary to minimum here because the presentation was very clear. So Sijie uses genealogies from 6 lineages to study questions of fertility and using quantitative methods. So there's roughly 3 basic sets of regression results. The first result is the one about reproductive relationships. Think about the relationship between the number of grandsons of a male indexed by I, and that's related to the number of sons of that male plus some control variables. And so we're interested in estimating growth here. And the extent that richer men have more sons, it could mean that the share of descendants of rich families increase over time. So I may have some comments towards the end, time permitting, on this result. Result number 2 is about marriage probability and how the marriage probability of a particular male, again indexed by I, is related to the number of brothers that he has. And there's also some covariates here. So there are some men from rich families, and where there are more brothers, they're more likely to marry. I agree with that result. I actually don't have substantive comments. The third result is about could you probability, so the civil service examination. And this is where the probability of a particular male I is related to the number of brothers that he has. And so we're interested in estimating delta here. And what Sijie finds is that the delta is statistically zero in appropriately saturated specifications, loss of controls, which means that there's no quantity quality trade-off, meaning there's no evidence that she finds that families restrict child quantity in order to have a successful degree recipient. And here I'll spend some more time because I have a comparative advantage on this particular result. Growth paper, it was published in 2017, where I find a quantity quality trade-off, meaning a negative coefficient. So I should qualify that a little bit by saying I find it during times of high return to human capital, meaning the early Qing, not throughout the period. So why is there no evidence for a quantity quality trade-off in this paper? And that's one of the things that interested me. So explanation one is that there might be regional variation in pre-modern China. So the specific counties and the families that Sijie is studying are just not the same everywhere. And sure, that might be the one of the explanations, and that's why it's important to have quantitative studies with genealogies from different regions. We'll see genealogy conference next week. We'll see data from France, the UK, China, and so it's why this kind of is so important. It adds dimension, and once webinar digitizes Chinese genealogies on a large scale, we'll see. So that's one possibility. Another explanation is what Sijie in her talk, and it's also in the paper. It's a high status man's household budget constraint. So he did not need to choose between.
I'm sorry, Professor, we seem to have lost it again here.
So you don't hear me anymore? I haven't done anything.
Okay, it's working now.
Okay, so it's maybe the internet in our building. So a high status man's household budget constraint was so high that he did not need to choose between child quantity and quality, but he could have both. And this might be a possibility, but there's this question then that why does some lineages, why do some people could have both, and why does it not apply to lineages everywhere, right? So what's the context? I'd like to know more about the specific families and their context, what's happening in the time period, their institutions, that makes this different across regions, like what's going on really. The other thing to realize is that Sijie has control variables on father's class, grandfather's class, lineage fixed effects. So these are precisely in the regression in order to eliminate the basic differences, such as high status and low status families. And so in that sense, the conclusion is still puzzling to me. Other explanations that I looked at, I thought about. So in my earlier paper, my 2017 paper, I showed that there was human human capital quantity quality trade-off for a period of high return to human capital. So not in the Yuan Ming and not in the late Qing. Here is the corresponding results from Sijie's paper, and she breaks this down into different periods: 1400 to 1600, 1600 to 1800. Here at the degree column, not the married column, and the coefficient is 1.031. So this is a logistic regression, and numbers above 1 correspond to 1, and OLS would be a positive number. So there's no Q in this 1600 to 1800 period. And I think heterogeneity might be part of the story. So let me spend a few minutes on that. One of the results that come from my own paper is how this relationship, how you can see that there's a much higher QQ coefficient. Now, remember, these are OLS regressions, and you can see that the coefficient for quantity equality is much stronger when there's a subsample in which the father and the grandfather are also educated. So in the baseline with the entire sample, it's minus 9% roughly. But if the father and grandfather are educated, then, and that's relatively few, a smaller sample in the population, but if they are educated, the coefficient goes to minus 42%. So clearly heterogeneity is playing an important role here. And another thing to realize is that when you compare the coding, I had 71% lowest status in my sample from the 7 genealogies because I was able to bring out every kind of detail about the individuals. And heterogeneity here can be seen in more detail. Here in this paper that we just saw, there's 95% lowest status, of which 3 are elite lineages, meaning they have more than 10% degree holders, and the other 3 lineages are common lineages, so much less. So the thought here is that it may be hard to separate the wealth effect from the human capital effect. There's a large overlap between status and degrees and the way that is defined. So it's important to look at the difference between class and what does degree mean in here. So I would say try a sample of people who have education regardless of the Keju. So students who tried to fail the exam, editors of the genealogy, literate people who may not have a degree. And then look at people with wealth and status, but no education, because at the end of the day, this degree doesn't mean education if the rich can buy degrees. So be very careful about coding up purchase degrees. Detail that we can absorb in a couple of minutes here, but I just want to show you the comparison. On the right side, this is Sijie's paper. She has 95% basically with no status, and the others are coded up according to a degree, right? Here's the column with whether or not there's a degree. And 4% of the sample has a degree, 5% has status and class, largely coming from that degree. But Q and Q, let me remind you, is based on education, not degree. And so maybe we want to look at people who have literate and educated but no academic degree, that those are educated people, right? So in my own coding, my own perspective of who's educated, if you look on the left side, I have these people coded up as 1 because they're educated. They are educated in my perspective. And the other thing to realize is that degree does not equal education. Degree is a social, political status symbol. But what about, teachers with no degree? What about purchase degrees? So when I look at purchase degrees, I have 133 of them, 1.5% of the sample. They're in there. They have money, essentially. Over here, the coding in. So, the paper, and you can see it's a logistic regression, there's degree, there's class, but there's no specific education variable that I would be looking out for. Another thing that I was concerned about is there's heterogeneity there, and then there's noise. And in this paper, only 31% of males have both birth and death dates. I had to pull this out of an earlier paper, 2023 paper, and it tells us more about the sample, but that's useful information because in Ted Telford's old 1980 he surveyed 919 genealogies. What he found was that about 80% of the cases for Jiangsu and Zhejiang genealogies, there are vital dates for husbands and wives. So that's husbands and wives usually have less data than husbands. And that raises a concern about data quality for observations, because even though this paper does not use vital dates, there's going to be some correlation across the quality of the genealogy when we look across different content. And even though you know vital dates for this particular study, it suggests that there's a noise issue, and that's a measurement error issue. So with classical measurement error, it'll bias OS towards 0, the regression coefficient towards 0. Suggestions along these lines would involve, say, more data cleaning. And even if you think you've done all the data cleaning that you can possibly do, you can still ask yourself if all the data is equally plausible. I mean, you basically want to make sure that the data you're using is sort of comparable. And so I would suggest maybe not using all the data, try dropping some observations for which maybe the vitals are missing. Or maybe, you know, you want to be judicious in thinking about estimating a propensity score of not having vital dates, and then create some sample weighting of weighted regression. Basically, the whole idea is that maybe you don't want to give equal plausibility, equal weight to all the observations. So that's one idea. And then back to results 1, I wanted to come back to that, which is the one about grandsons and sons. So I actually fully expect, I would say, that most models would say this row here is positive unless there's some kind of very strong Malthusian check that we see men that have more sons also have more grandsons. And on the other hand, quadratic is strong. So this is that it's a prediction that arises after imposing a quadratic form. And if you look on the left side here with people where there's 10, 11, 12 sons, less than 1%, it makes the less convincing. I don't see strong evidence for quadratic. I know there's incentives to find that shape because of the Glore and Klemp paper, but in this particular case, I'm not quite sure it fits. So I have some additional comments that are here. I know I'm running out of time, but let me just mention it very, very briefly. One is, I think some more background material on the genealogies is actually needed in this paper to make it fully standalone comprehensive paper. So summary statistics, an establishment of the representation of the sample, the representativeness of the sample to the extent that's possible. And of course, we want to watch for overlap between the present paper and your paper in the Journal of Population Economics, you know, the paper Survival of the Literati, Social Status and Reproduction. That also is about reproduction, and it uses the same sample. 2 more comments. One is, I think this logistic, you know, incidence rate ratio requires some more work for the reader, and so at least do a regression that is in OLS, so it's easier to understand. And finally, I'm not sure that OIV satisfies the exclusion restriction. Age at first birth, really affect degree, only stories. But even if you do go ahead and use that IV, there should be some more discussion why the results are similar and interpreted. So overall, it's a interesting paper to fully exploit the genealogical data. I would just say look at the heterogeneity, look at the noise, consider the noise, and then talk about how the results make sense in the specific context. If those high status men are not experiencing constraints of any kind, then where are the constraints? When do they experience constraints? And if not them, then who, right? So Chinese family genealogies are certainly a very rich and unique data source, and there's so much that we can do with them. There's just immense potential for publications, not only in population journals, but also in top general journals. So congratulations and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hu. Thank you very much.
Yes, do you want to just say give a quick response before we move on to the Q&A session?
Yes, so thank you so much, Professor, for all these comments and also the very valuable feedback, and all the points are will be well taken, and especially on the point about the class education and also degree. I know that it's just I didn't do. I will just separate the purchase degrees out of the way that I measure human capital here, and I found it's just there's a problem, because for all the men who actually purchase a degree, in my variable now that I count them as a person who had a high human capital, and that's basically is problematic. And also, especially for the heterogeneous genealogy problem, that's true. Yeah, I think that it's. As you mentioned, that also the the elite lineages that I'm looking at here is very elite, but also because I control for the lineage fixity factor, so it shouldn't be just I need to go over into the details about the lineage themselves, and so where were their constraints? There must be some constraints for them, even if they are the most kind of elite lineages in China. Yes, and also for the IV, and that I actually tried another IV before, but I don't think I also feel that maybe not works. Just I use the adoption practice as IIV, just for people who adopted out a son, and that's just lose one son, and I tried to use that as IIV, but I think that it's also easy to think about the story that would violate the exclusive restriction, but I will think about that more and carefully. And thank you very much. And I think that all these points that I have written them down, and I will definitely hope to find ways to solve all these problems. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's now just to have a look of the questions here. The first question is about what's the meaning of how in control variables. I think one of the slides have already mentioned that, but you can give a very quick response to that question.
Yeah, it's just yeah, as I said, that I want to, I think that my social class variable and also the number of marriages variable cannot capture everything about a man's social and economic factors or characteristics. So that's another way because I think how is quite useful as a kind of basic literacy human capital measure. It's like the signature literacy measure that we always see in the Western European studies, that they use whether a man could sign their name as a human capital measure. So I use this how just I think it's quite similar to that kind of measure. It's to show that at least this man has some kind of basic literacy training. So that may also mean something for his own socioeconomic characteristics. And that's why I control for that. Yes.
For the next two questions, are there a lot of efforts spent on obtaining data from the genealogy books, and does more data help consolidating the results? And is there any similar data from other parts of the world? Well,
I think Professor Hu just mentioned that, right? And we have genealogies in China, but also in UK, in France, and all over the world. But for the Chinese genealogical, yes, I did spend a lot, about 2 years in transcribing the data and also try to clean the data. So it's quite time consuming. And of course, if I had more data, that would definitely consolidate the results. And that's also what we are trying to do now, and just to transcribe more genealogical data and also from different places. And we, as I think we have already seen that in different places in China that there are actually a lot of different regional variations. So it would be best if we could have the genealogies of all over China, and we can have a more solid and generalized picture of China's history. Yeah. So
Okay, so the next two questions from Qiu Zhen. I would like to know whether you considered check other fertility choice model except for the Q&Q trade-off model, and besides, given your sample include people in different periods of time, do you consider the change of public health system among these periods? And then a follow-up question from this is for the subsample of girls, would mind briefly discussing whether you find the evidence of missing girls among these 6 lineages? Thanks.
yeah, so thank you very much for the question. And I think for the first question, yes, I also try to look at the different fertility choice. Like I said, that I also I've already done a paper on whether they have fertility controls in the 6 lineages, and I try to but it's not that just I think it's still better to have more genealogies, because if we want to look at like questions about fertility controls, we usually use females fertility as the we need to have the females fertility data, and but just in genealogies, it's the females data is quite under-registered. So I also hope that when I have more genealogical data, that I can reconstruct maybe that part of my analysis. And also for yes, for the public health system, I think the reason why I didn't consider much about that is that the places I'm looking at are quite close to each other, and also for maybe only for the late 19th century or in the 19th century, then maybe we can see some improvement in the public health. So that's just for that part. I think my observations for that period after 1850 is quite the sample size is quite small, because most of all those lineages, the genealogies I'm using are they compiled before 1875, something like that. So the final several generations just have a smaller number of observations in my sample. But thank you very much, and I'll try to consider that in my analysis. And also, yes, for the missing girls, I actually try to use my the sample that I'm having now to do a missing girls paper. But it's also hard to, because as I mentioned, just for all these men, there are 2 kinds of missing. One is the actual missing, the physical missing, like because of the female infanticide or parental neglect, the daughters were missing. But there is also this kind of institutional missing, just the daughters were not ritualistically significant, so they were not recorded in the genealogies, and the genealogies would not say that, okay, actually this father has some daughters, but just because they are not significant, so we didn't include them. So we actually don't know the criteria for the why some daughters were included in the genealogies, but some are not. But in some, in the Jia lineage that I'm looking at, it's quite clear that they only include daughters who are chaste widows. So that's very clear. So only 23 daughters were included in the Jia lineage's genealogy, and they are all chaste widows being praised by the government. But that's very clear. But for the other lineages, just I cannot tell why is it some daughters were recorded, but some are not. So then it just makes it very challenging to look at this missing daughter problem. But I'm still trying to figure out how should I analyze this missing daughters by using my sample. So thank you very much, and I hope I can show you my result on missing daughters soon.
Since we're running out of time, I will just leave the last two questions till the end of this part. Now I think Devin also have a question, so I would just give the time to Devin for the question.
I can't start my video. No, it's not so much a question. I like the presentation and like the comments as well. I think Carol's point about, which is something that I was concerned as well. You have really 5% of the population that's the high status one. The rest of, despite your 14 categories, but all of them are in the 5%. But so your result is more valid for the top whatever 5%. That's still okay. Maybe you can make a point about that. But the other issue is, despite having pointed all of that, it's quite difficult to get other indicators, right? That's the problem because we do not have very good wealth measures, or all the other measures do not capture very well. And that's I think a very realistic issue. Another point is it's great you have these 6 lineages. You added up this huge sample size, but it's actually coming from 6 lineages, right? That's part of the problem. You do not have cross-sectional variation in that regard, and that may be missing some of the variation as well. But other than that, that's a really, really great paper.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, well, since we're on time, I will make sure the rest of the 2 questions will be delivered to our speaker by the end of the talk today. So anyway, well, thanks everyone again for joining us today, and thanks Sijie for delivering this very interesting paper, and also a very big thanks to Professor Carol here to give her generous comments on Sijie's paper. And thanks everyone for joining us. And it's very lovely to Zhu's here, but I'll ask him whether he wanted to say something. But anyway, thanks everyone. It's really great to hear this topic, and so please do follow up on our next topic, which will be announced on our website and also on Twitter in a later time. And so thank you very much, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Professor Qing. Thank you. And see you soon in London.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. See you.